Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar from the FDA on how to run effective virtual meetings, something I'm sure we're all doing at the moment. I'm Anna from the TUC, and shortly I'll be handing over to Katie, who will be presenting the main part of today. Just before we get going, a little bit of housekeeping. So you'll see that there's a chat panel on the right hand side of the screen, and it's great to see so many people already introducing themselves and telling us a bit about where they're from, what their job is. Maybe we often get people saying whether it's sunny or not, a bit about the weather as well. If you do want to share that, fantastic. Also, underneath the main screen, underneath Katie and I, is a section where there's an Ask a Question button. Please use that to post any questions that you might have for Katie during the webinar, and she'll get them after the main presentation. Time permitting. I'm sure that there's always loads of time, so please post questions. Just one final thing, if you miss any part of the webinar or you want to check anything, the FDA will be sending a link to a recording round later today, along with any resources that we mentioned, including the PowerPoint. So I'm going to hand over to Katie now to get going with the presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Anna, and hello to everybody. Lovely to see some familiar faces on the sidebar here. People from all four corners of the UK, and I've spotted someone from Brussels and an old friend of mine from Germany. So hello. So for those who don't know me, I'm Katie Driver. I worked in the civil service for very many years in the UK in Department for Education and Department for Work and Pensions, and had the joy of meetings in all sorts of setups, mostly face-to-face, but we did have the good old video rooms set up, which I'm sure some of you will have been familiar with. But of course, we're now all having our meetings online, and for the last 6 years, I've been working as a coach and a trainer and facilitator, and working with people on how to think well individually and how to think well together. And a meeting, in theory, should be a fantastic opportunity for a group of people to think well together on a particular topic or challenge that's relevant to them. However, if your experience is anything like mine or anything like the people that I regularly talk to, most of you will not have had great experiences of meetings, even when they were face-to-face. And I suspect that at least some of the meetings you've been in online have been, well, fair to middling might be a good day. So I hope that what we're going to be able to do today is to share some thinking, share some ideas about how to get these virtual meetings really up and cooking so that you can really get the very best from everybody who's joining in. A welcome to folks who aren't normally on these webinars. It's been fantastic that FDA have opened this up to other people. So if you're not an FDA member, that's fine and wonderful and lovely to have you here. And if you are an FDA member, excellent. And you'll know all the good stuff that they already do for their members. And, you know, it's worth joining if you're eligible or interested. Okay, so today it's all about how to run effective virtual meetings. So that's me, or not me, the name is me, not the picture, obviously. And we're going to go through 7 areas, 7 A's for effective meetings. And really these A's are a way for me to organise my thoughts. So that's where they've come from. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run through them in groups of 2 or 3, because there's 7 of them. And I'm going to pause from time to time and ask you questions and give you a chance to offer your thoughts, your insights, because one of the fantastic things about having 470 people on this webinar is that there are 470 different ideas and different ways of running things, different sets of experiences. So it would be brilliant to hear some of those as we go down the chat box. Before we dive in any further, I'm going to ask you, as I did last week, if anyone was tuning in on Monday last week, to have a think for yourself about what attention score you want to give yourself for this next hour. And a score of 1 to 7, where 1 is I'm really only dialing in and not really listening properly, to 7 is I'm all ears and I'm really interested and I want to give this a really fantastic level of attention. Think what your mental 1 to 7 is going to be, and then just take a couple of seconds to change or to do whatever it is that you need to do so that you can sustain that level of attention. So if you want to give it your all, make sure that you've turned your phone onto silent, you've shut the door perhaps, or you've checked that the kids are watching something that they're interested in. I'm glad to see some high numbers up there. That's fantastic. Do whatever it is you need to do to make sure that you can sustain that for this next hour. Okay, great. Now I really like to get the ball rolling, as you'll know, with a question. So it's going to pop up on the box here now. What is the best virtual meeting that you've attended so far? And Jenny, don't worry about a child on the sofa. It'll all be fine. So the best virtual meeting that you've attended so far. Drop a few thoughts in the chat box about what it was that seemed to be effective. What was a good meeting? And I imagine that there is at least some of you thinking, I'm tempted to say that my best meeting was the cancelled one. And I know it's fantastic when you get a cancelled meeting, you think, yes, I've got half an hour, 2 hours in my diary. But actually, that's quite interesting when your best thought is that it was the cancelled one. It's really interesting reflection as to whether that meeting was going to be a good use of your time and your energy. Did you feel engaged? What was it about that meeting that made you feel relief that it was going to be cancelled rather than upset that it was going to be cancelled? So some great stuff coming up in here, kind of structure, humour, visuals, clear agenda, small groups, being able to take breaks, people asking for responses, all of those things. Fantastic, really good to see what you're noticing that works for you when you're taking part in meetings. Because if you're going to be running a meeting, you need to be thinking about, what is it that works for me that I think might work for other people? What is it that I already know, but I need to put into practice at this point in time? Different speakers, not just one person talking, sorry. Well, we have got Anna as well. Giving people the chance to contribute, making sure that there are those breakouts. So yeah, you do know what makes for a good meeting. And there are lots of these things that you can make sure work really effectively when you're working online. So let's move into our first A, which is the agenda, the all-important agenda for your meeting. And actually, the most important question you can probably ask yourself is, do we need to meet at all? Do we have to be getting together in this way, or actually is there a different way of getting through the business? Once you've assumed that you've decided that you are going to have a meeting, then purpose is the next thing to think about. Why do I want to get this group of people together? What is the most important thing that we need to get out of our time? And you can think about this both for the meeting as a whole and for particular agenda items. So there are 3 kind of key words there. You might think of others. So some items, some reasons we get together are to share information. Perhaps one person has had a really important conversation with a stakeholder or a partner. Perhaps someone has come back from a meeting with a minister. Perhaps there is a new data set that's just about to be released or has just been released, and that information needs to be shared. Perfectly legitimate reason for having a meeting. I'll come back to that, to be really, really focused. Next thought might be about, you might want to decide whether you want, sorry, Anna, I'm still on the first one. The next purpose might be to make a decision. So is there a point coming up in a project or a decision about whether to send a submission up to a minister or to put something to a board or exco? What has to actually happen? Or maybe it's an opportunity to debate, to choose something over, to get the voices of the different people that you want to gather in your meeting. And it's that clarity of purpose which is so important for getting your agenda really focused and exactly what you want it to be. So the next thing you can do once you've got that purpose is to pose your agenda items as questions. So let's say you've decided you've got an information item. Maybe instead of saying latest unemployment statistics or latest sign-ups on universal credit or latest number of whatever it is, maybe the question actually, why do you care about that? It is something like, how do we adapt what we do in the light of this information? Or what trends are we looking for that help us interpret this information more usefully? Or do we understand this information? Are there others, other analysts or other experts that we need to work with? So using the core purpose and then thinking, what's the question that really spins out of this that I want to have people really engage with? So agenda items posed as questions really help to home in on what you actually want to get out of your meeting. And then the third thing to think about on the agendas is timed agenda. People have said in the sidebar already that one of the things they've found effective in meetings is having short, sharp meetings, 60 minutes, maybe 30 minutes. You could play, you could be 15 minutes, 25 minutes, just because the diary comes in those particular lengths of segments doesn't mean that you have to. But the key thing with a timed agenda is to think about what do you really want to spend the time and the discussion on, and to give people that signal up front. I go to governors meetings. I'm a governor at my local FE college group, and the clerk always gives us a really closely timed agenda. And when it arrives, I think, oh, crikey, that's an awful lot to get through. Actually, it's a really useful discipline, and it's a great signal to see the 3 or 4 items with a longer chunk of time. And we know that those are the ones we need to prepare and really think about, and the items that have got a kind of fairly crisp 2, 3, 5 minute slot where we know it's going to be very much a kind of check that everybody's okay with this. So you can use your timed agenda as a way of really guiding people before they ever even get to the virtual room to make sure that they've done their prep accordingly. So if you've got your agenda, the next A is to think about your attendees. And it's really only after you've got your purpose and your agenda sorted that you can start to think, okay, so who am I going to invite? And I guess some of you are already asking the question, well, what's the ideal number for a meeting? The problem is there isn't an ideal number. The word that's going to come up on the slide in a moment is Goldilocks. There is a just right amount of people for your particular agenda and your particular purpose. I would suggest that for a really important, focused decision-making meeting, if you're going much into double figures, you're going to have difficulty managing all the different views in the room and coming to a good decision. So probably something in the region of 8 to 10 people is good for a close, focused decision-making meeting. If it's information sharing, the sky's the limit. We've got 485 people here. It's not exactly a meeting, but some organizations run town halls or big kind of sharing events, and you can go to a large number, but be mindful of how much real engagement you're going to get from people at that sort of size. So think to yourself, what is the just right number, the Goldilocks number for my meeting attendees? And if you're struggling and thinking, oh gosh, I really haven't got a clue as to how I can get to that, there are some questions that are going to come up. So you could be thinking about, well, what do I want my people actually to do as a result of this meeting? Having a sense of what you want them to go away with, what you want them to do in response to the meeting. So that's the first of the questions. And I don't know if there's a bit of a delay on this one. Smashing, thank you. The second question to ask yourself is, whose thinking do I need the most? It's tempting sometimes to just invite the same old group of people to a meeting, but actually, if you want to really crack open a challenge or come to a good decision, you do need to be aware of whose thinking you need to bring into the room and invite them accordingly. And the final question on this slide, please, Anna, if you could do 2 clicks for me, is to ask yourself who needs to be there with the decision making. So if you are going to need a decision, have you actually got the person in the room with the authority to take that decision, or at least the authority to brief the next person up? It's really frustrating trying to come to a decision, and you've got some people in the room and they all say, well, actually, yeah, I'm going to have to take that back, or I'm not sure, or I can't commit to it today. You know, if you need people to commit to it today, you've got to have those folks in the room right now, not their proxies or not someone that they've sent in isolation. So have a think about, who is it that's going to take the decision? Do I have to have them in the room with me? So those are some of the questions that you can use to get into the attendees for your meeting. So let's move on to the next A, which is about access. And this is one, if you remember back in the old days when we used to get together in rooms, there would sometimes be that moment as you started to gather together and someone would say, actually, we need some more chairs. And someone would go out and kind of raid the office space outside and find some chairs and drag them in. Or you'd be trying to dial someone in on the spider phone or get something up on the presentation and it wasn't working. So you just put out a call to the help desk, or you ran outside and you found the person who you knew was a whiz and they would fix it for you. That's great. It doesn't work when you're working online. You haven't got that phone a friend option. You haven't got that kind of capacity to drag in a chair. So you're going to need to think in advance about the access. How do you get people in a position to contribute? So first reminder is make sure that you're checking out things like kit, software, bandwidth. Some of us are lucky that we have a reasonably sort of okay supply, the bandwidth data is not bad. Some of us are not so lucky. Some of us are sharing laptops or kind of whatever kit we've got amongst 2, 3, 4 people. Particularly if you're working with new people to your meetings, make sure you've established in advance what kind of access they've got in terms of the kit. And thank you, Madeline, your point, I'm just noticing in the chat about decision makers in the room, and your point that we could be better as leaders at empowering our teams. And I do think that's right. We can't always have all the decision makers in every room all of the time. They can't cut themselves in that many pieces. So being clear about what can and can't be decided at whatever level is really helpful. So on the access point, second thought is to make sure you're keeping in mind the reasonable adjustments that we need to make in terms of colleagues with protected characteristics, and to be honest, to make sure you're being reasonable in what you're asking folks to do. So making sure you've asked up front, what do people need in terms of time or breaks, of whether they need their cameras on or off, whether they need particular bits of information to be sent or shared in particular ways for them to take part. So don't forget about that. And the third one on the access point is to send the agenda and papers in advance. Now, this is good practice when you're having a meeting face-to-face and virtually. And it's amazing how many meetings I've certainly turned up to where I might have been lucky to get the agenda, but a paper gets tabled and it's an important paper and it's something I'd like to read. If we do that to our colleagues virtually, it's bad enough trying to look at a screen and Zoom or MS Teams or whatever thing you're using, and then having a paper that's in a different box, and it might be a long paper and it might be in teeny tiny font because you're trying to cram 2 different things together. If you want people to properly engage with the material and read it and think about it, make sure they've got it in advance. Then if folks need to print it and they're able to, then they can. And they've got that sense of, okay, this is the question, this is the information, what does my brain already think about this? They're coming really properly prepared and well able to access everything that's going to be going on in the meeting. So let's do a quick question check with the next slide. I'd love to hear what you've been doing to set up your meetings for success. So the things you've done before you've got the folks in the room, what is it that you've done to make sure that people arrive with what they need? And thank you for the validation. Nothing worse than sitting remotely without the necessary papers. Absolutely, it's terrible. You can't hear properly, you can't see what's going on, and everybody's talking about something you can't see. So that sharing is really important. Great, thank you, Lorne. Yeah, testing everything. Yeah, having a dry run is really worth doing. You've probably begun to get into the swing of things a bit, but you know, there are new kind of elements coming onto all of these systems all the time. Different organizations are using different setups. So if you're dialing into different kinds of meetings, you want to be sure that you can set up everything. So yeah, again, dummy runs, sending things in advance, clear indications of how long it will work. There's something about a virtual coffee table. Oh, I'm going to scroll back to that one if I can see it. No, it's gone so fast. Making sure there's a chairs brief. That's a great idea if it's not your meeting, but you're wanting to be sure that it goes effectively. A chairs brief can be really good, particularly if you can put in some of these little process things in as well. Having meetings early in the day, possibly, yeah, that suits some people. Others it's not so great, but it's part of that access point is to have a conversation about when is a good time for people to be able to join, particularly if it's a time where you want to get that regular commitment out of people. And someone here is talking about focus mini meetings leading up to an overall decision-making team meeting. Yeah, so that can be a great way of not having everybody online for a large amount of time, having some small meetings. Yeah, and not too much, not too early in the day. Yeah, some folks are kind of eager and ready for meetings at 7:30, and some people are like, I'm still in bed, I'm still asleep. So, okay, let's move into the next A, which is about grabbing people's attention. Oh, and I should also just double check if any of these questions. Yes, I had a question. I'll come back to your question about whether to decide having a meeting or not. But this is a good point to look at this other question, how to tackle in a productive way where some of the people attending haven't prepared properly. Time is wasted as a result. Okay, so this next piece is absolutely on attention. I think you need to set the expectation early that people are going to contribute and are going to be involved in the conversation. There's nothing like knowing that your name is going to be called for making you think, oh, actually, I'm going to read these papers and have something that I want to say in advance. It can be deeply uncomfortable. I say that as an introvert, to have your name kind of picked on in a meeting, but it does keep me on my toes, and done gently and wisely can be a great way of getting people to contribute. But it doesn't have to be you know, by kind of calling out people's names and saying, okay, so Fred, what do you think? What you can do is, rather like we did right at the start of this, when we said in the chat box, you know, please say, you know, where you are, whether that's organizationally or geographically, and say something about, you know, what the weather's like. If you've got a small enough meeting, that's a really nice way to start, just to check out, you know, what can you see from your desk right now, or you know, what are you working on for the rest of today? A more focused work one, I'll give you this, is 3 W's. So ask people to say what they're winning with. So a quick win, what's gone well for them. So the 3 W's are win, work, a wish. So what is it I'm winning with? What is it I'm working on? So, you know, in the next week before we meet again, this is what I want to achieve. And what is their wish? What would they really like to have? Information from a colleague, or permission to do something, or, you know, that they want to say something. So getting people early on to say a win, a working on, and a wish can be a really nice way of getting them to contribute. So next thing on attention is, if people have video and if the setup permits, it is good to use video. We do tend to engage ourselves more when we know we might be watched with other people, and we quite like to see that other people are involved. It's not going to be possible all the time on every meeting, and we do need to be very mindful that it can be quite intense to have a whole series of meetings that are all face-to-face, all quite focused face-to-face in the way that they are on Zoom and Teams, and that can be quite wearing. So we don't necessarily have to assume everybody's on video all the time, but do be mindful of it to bring it in where you can, or maybe people put video on to start and have a bit of chit chat with the video on and then switch off for other parts of the meeting. So yeah, Tiffany, thank you. Yeah, video can be draining if you have a lot of the meetings. So third point is to ask really focused questions. So this goes to not only having that focused agenda with questions on it, but also to have a sense of, what are some key questions I could throw into the conversation to help get people thinking and engaging. Yeah, and the point, the video about bandwidth can be quite tricky. So asking focused questions. So, what proportion of your time is spent on meetings, or how many of you are struggling with this right now? Or, those kinds of open questions that get people engaged can be really, really useful, so that people are more attentive to a specific and direct thing rather than a generic kind of how's it all going, which is a bit too vague and everybody waits for somebody else to say something. And a really nice observation from Stephanie I noticed in the sidebar about there is an opportunity to hear people better if you're going through a fairly rigorous unmute system. People can say what they need to say and get to the whole end of the point and then choose to put their mute back on. And people have a much clearer signal sometimes about when they need to say something, when they're going to stop, or when they can next come in. So final thought on attention is to experiment with things. Just because we're now doing things virtually, it's tempting, I know, to start with, to kind of transplant all the stuff you used to do face to face, pick it up and stick it on and do it virtually. Doesn't always work. And also with some of this tech, you've got new things that you can play with, like chat box. You can't have a chat box in a face-to-face meeting. That's called passing notes and being rude and kind of not giving your attention. A chat box in this kind of setup can be a really good way of getting some extra thoughts, getting some ideas. So have a play. Think about what is it that you can do to make things different. As human beings, we love novelty. So a way of getting people's attention is to do some experimentation. Just mindful on this videoing point that yes, we are now in people's workplaces. Their homes are their workplaces. So that's another reason why the video thing can be a bit sensitive, which, it definitely says video if possible, and that's worth having the conversation, particularly if it's a regular meeting. So you've got people's attention. The next A is to think about how do we get towards agreement? Because agreement, well, if you went to a meeting where everybody around the table agreed, around the virtual table, my contention is that would be a pretty rubbish meeting, because all you've done is hear 8 or 9 or however many versions of exactly the same thing. And one of the things that you really need to be doing for a properly effective meeting is getting differences of view and possibly disagreements, getting those open. So I'm going to run through some ways that you can do that virtually. The first one that's coming up here is something called rounds. So if you have, say, 8 to 10 people for your meeting, these don't work for very large meetings, but let's say you have 6, 7, 8 people in your meeting. If you ask each person to get themselves a scrap of paper, whatever they have lying around, and draw a circle on it, and then suggest to people that they write the names of those attending in the meeting rather like a clock face. I often do it alphabetically. So I'd say Alex goes at 12 o'clock position, Fred is going to go at 2 o'clock position, Jane is going to go at the 4 o'clock position. You kind of go round and everybody then has the same image in front of them. Then when you get to a point where you'd like to hear everybody speak, you can say, okay, let's do a round on this. Whoever has something to say, they can go first, and then we'll go clockwise or anti-clockwise, doesn't matter. And to say, we've got 2 minutes for this, and we need to share the time equally, which is a signal both not to hog the time for those who tend to say a little bit more than perhaps they need to, and also a reminder that the people who perhaps may not have said so much, don't deprive your colleagues of your thoughts because they're really valuable. And in a round, you simply go round and each person says their piece, and it's a way of getting everybody to say what they need to in a safe way and without interruption and without asking questions. Once you've done the round, then you can open up the conversation again and say, okay, so what's now the most important thing about this question, or has the question changed, or, you know, where are we? So rounds can be a really nice way of making sure that you get people's conversation out there. Next point is to think about breakout rooms or some offline time. It depends on what kit you're using, what setup you've got as to exactly what you want to do. But sometimes you get to a point in a conversation where you think things have all got a bit heated, or there's a really kind of rich discussion that needs to come out, but we're not set up in a way that's allowing for that. So you could, if you've got breakout rooms, you can kind of divide people up into smaller numbers with a clear question to consider. You could ask people to switch off mic and video and do a bit of personal reflection. Say, okay, everybody, for 2 minutes, let's kind of switch off our screens and do a quick bit of thinking about this, and then we'll come back and we'll have a round. So that could be another way of doing it. If you're in phone contact, you could suggest the quick pairs of phone conversations. So there are all sorts of things you can play with that break up the conversation, make it easier for people to have their say, to think things through and come back with their freshest thinking. Yeah, Amanda, thank you. You've seen rounds done where you're going through the list alphabetically and back again in reverse. So yeah, that could be a nice way of making sure people have the chance to react. So rounds of breakout rooms can all help with getting everything out there. Then you've got things like chats and virtual whiteboards, stickies, all of those things. Again, depends on what your setup is. And there's a very useful and valid point on the sidebar earlier that some of these things are not particularly helpful for people with dyslexia, for example. Or, yeah, obviously depends how that manifests itself. For some people, actually, to be honest, finger moments have brilliant spelling. So let's not put on our pedantic spelling hats. Let's allow people to say what they need to say. And sorry, I know that dyslexia is a broader issue than that, but you know, we need to think about how do we use some of these alternative ways of engaging with people to get the conversation going, to get it out there. And well, the fourth point really is to be mindful of virtual miscommunication. The fact that when we put things across virtually, sometimes we don't put in the niceties that we would if we were face to face, and sometimes that's refreshing, but sometimes it means things come over as a bit blunt and they're not actually meant to be blunt. My kids are always telling me stuff like, you know, when I started using WhatsApp back in the day, I would kind of put my name at the end of things. They say, Mom, you don't need to put your name, we know it's from you. So, you know, there's stuff that may be generational, that may be different platforms, that kind of stuff. So if you see something or you hear something from someone and your immediate reaction is just pause for a moment and think, hang on a minute, did they really mean that, or am I taking on board more than is meant to be there? And you can check things out. So finding ways to get the conversation out there, and then if you have got lots of differences of view, I think two things that really help in coming towards that agreement. The first is to remind yourselves what your outcome is. What is it that you really want to achieve from the meeting or from the policy or from the work area? What's your big prize? And can you fashion from the conversation collectively some criteria that help you make that decision? So actually, what can be really helpful is to say, okay, so of all of the things that people have shared that they liked or disliked about this possible way forward, what are the key things we have to get right? And they start to emerge as your possible list of criteria. And people feel much more comfortable sharing that. Once you've got to that, once you know what your outcome is, then it becomes much easier and calmer to have a conversation about, well, which possible ways forward best meet those kinds of criteria and still get us to where we need to go. So I've run through a lot of different things there about attention and agreement. And I'd like again to pause and ask you, what helps you to engage in a meeting and contribute really well? So you're in the meeting, what is it that means that you think, yeah, I've got something to say and I'm happy to say it? So pop in your thoughts on the chat bar. Any extra things? What helps you to contribute? And in the meantime, there's a great question here from Nick. What's the best way to manage contributors to prevent people talking over each other in a virtual meeting and ensure that everybody who wants to say something can say something? Yeah, I mean, I think that's where things like rounds help, because people know that they have their turn that's coming. So that can be really nice. Sometimes you have to call people out. Sometimes you can use a kind of raise a hand function. And I think it's also good to remind people that the time does need to be shared equally. So if you're the chair, you may on occasion have to cut people short to say, thanks, Fred, that's a really useful point. I'm going to ask if we keep that short because I know that other people will want to say things. So sometimes you have to manage the chairing a lot more overtly than you otherwise would. So some of the things that are coming through that others are noticing that helps them to engage is, the chair's got an open manner, chairing, valuing others' contributions. So being very overt if it's your meeting, I want to hear your views. I'd like to hear what you're thinking about this. I don't know the answer. Having that humility as the chair or the leader, to say, what is it that you want to share with me? And ensuring people are on the meeting because they need to be, rather than just because they happen to be around. And Julie's good question. It would be helpful to understand what stops people engaging or contributing. Yeah, I mean, my first thoughts on that are, one of the things that really makes a difference is if people feel safe. If I don't feel safe, if I feel I'm going to write something or say something and I'm going to get shouted down straight away or argued against, and I don't feel that will come from a positive place, I may not say something. So how do we make it safe for people to say what they need to say? Or I might not engage because I might be uninterested. And that's down to the quality of the agenda. Have I invited the right people? Have I set up the questions correctly? Am I allowed to say, I'm not sure that that's the right question? I think it's this question. How much conversation can we have around the process of the meeting? Some other lovely points coming in here. Brisk paces, but opportunities to contribute where it's appropriate, understanding roles and responsibilities, and again, making sure that we try and keep that balance between people talking and people who may be quieter. And sometimes actually using the mute function or the unmute function as a chair, if you can do that kind of sensitively, you can really kind of shift the balance away from the people who tend to say a little more than perhaps they ought to. Okay, conscious of the time, so let's move on to our final two A's. And the first of those is action. If you've had your effective meeting, one of the things you probably will have wanted to generate is some kind of action. And the opportunities for miscommunication, for misunderstanding when you're working virtually are huge. They're always pretty big, but they just take on a whole extra layer in this virtual setting, because all we can see in our virtual meetings, if we've got the video on, and that may be a big if we've got the video on, you've got head and shoulders. You can't see all those other visual signals that you normally would be able to pick up on to figure out, are people with me? Are they not? Have they understood, etc., etc. So make sure that we keep a really good record of the action. So the first thing to do, and this is, I hope, good practice anyway in any kind of meeting, but be really specific about who is going to do what, by when, consulting whoever, any of those kind of process things. Even better if you can ask people to go round. Maybe you have a round at the end of the meeting saying, okay, can I check what everybody is taking away from this meeting? So each person says, I'm going to read this and send everybody a quick summary. I'm going to find that. I'm going to have a conversation with so-and-so, all of that kind of stuff. So be really, really specific. Next point on action is to flag up what resources people can access, what's available to them, who can they go to if they get stuck. We've lost the ability to pop along to catch up with someone to say, oh, I didn't quite understand or whatever, and it feels like much more of a big deal to ring someone up these days. At least that's my sense. So making it clear, okay, so if you're writing a paper to go to the board, here's the file list where you can find the previous ones, or Jane did one 3 weeks ago, to have a conversation with her about how she put it together, or here's the number for somebody who's got some extra guidance on it. So being really clear about who to ask for help and where people can go, so it feels okay then to follow up on that. And final point is, and Brian's already anticipated, record it in some kind of follow-up email or however else you record things, because not everybody may have been able to attend. You may have intentionally chosen not to have everybody at the meeting. Some people may have not been able to hear properly, or they might not have seen exactly everything that you wanted them to see. So that simple follow-up email that says, this is what we're doing, this is who's going to do it, this is when, is a really good thing to refer back to. It saves time when you come back to the next meeting. You don't necessarily have to go through the whole thing. Hopefully people will have picked it up. So real clarity about your action. And the last A, and this is me kind of fudging my A's a little bit, but I wanted to make sure that I left you with a reminder of thinking about the process or the approach that you have taken about the meeting. Amanda, I'll come back to your question. Sorry, I don't want to forget it. Actions assigned to non-meeting people. Approach. So I think what we need to do is to spend a few moments at the end of our regular meetings, either in the meeting ideally, or perhaps afterwards, thinking and reviewing the meeting to see how it went. So a regular review is a really good thing to do. One of the things that you can ask, and if you can pop up the first 2 points, I think, yeah, and the next one, smashing. If I do action learning sets with people quite often, which is a kind of group coaching setup. And one of the things that you do very formally in an action learning set is, after the thinking session, you have a process review. And so I will ask each person to share what's one thing that went well and one thing that could be even better if. Those of you who've got anything to do with the school system might recognise these questions. A lot of teachers use them. So towards the end of your meeting, you could do a round, have a quick conversation. What's one thing, and one thing is a really good way to stop people kind of taking too much time. What's one thing that went well with this meeting, and what's one thing that would be an even better if for next time we run it? It's a lovely way of getting people's idea of what it is that they have signed themselves up for, and how we could do the meetings better in the future. Ideas and experiments are another area to think about. So what could you play with? What in the last week, last month have people seen? What kind of meetings have they been to? Because you'll all be in all sorts of different kinds of meetings. You might have come back with an idea from this that you want to suggest in a future meeting. So having a moment towards the end of the meeting to say, okay, so what else is new? What else could we try to make sure this is really good? And final thought on approach is to think about, what are we learning? What are the lessons we can gather for the future, either for future virtual meetings or for when we can get around the table face to face, or when we're in a kind of mixed position. And we're probably, I mean, it was always the case that many meetings in the civil service had some people in a room, some people on the spider phone, some people on video, whatever. So what are the things that are working that you want to keep, whatever the meeting setup is, and what are the things that you might want to chop and change in future sorts of setups? So taking that bit of time for reviewing is really worth doing if you want to have those effective meetings going forward. Okay, so I'm going to ask the last question for you. And this is really a bit of a free-for-all, but it's a reminder about the importance of keeping meetings under review. You probably spend a really significant portion of your week in meetings. So it's worthwhile figuring out how you're going to make them better and better, whether your meetings, whether they're ones that you run or whether they're ones you're attending. What is it that you can do to kind of nudge them up all the time? So stuff in the chat box, what is it that you do to keep improving your meetings? And in the meantime, I just want to pick up this point from Amanda about the practice of assigning actions to people who aren't at the meeting. What do I think about that? It happens. I think sometimes it's entirely legitimate to need somebody else beyond the meeting to do something. So I think what you need to do is to make it clear why that person might be the right person to take the action forward within the meeting, and then follow up and have a conversation with them afterwards to say, we thought that you were the person that ought to take this forward, and this is why we thought that. Do you agree? What help do you need? What kind of conversation do we need to have about it? So check it out. Okay, so while I was talking, some great stuff coming in there. Debriefings, being systematic on reflecting with participants. Yep, making sure that's always on the agenda item. Oh, I like this. I now only attend meetings that have a clear purpose and where I feel I can add value. Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, if you don't know why you're meant to be in the meeting, well, why would you waste your time going to it? You could kind of send a little email. I've done this in the past. If you've been invited to a meeting and you're not really quite sure why you've been invited or what your role is, actually have a conversation with the chair or the organizer and say, I see I'm meant to be coming along to this thing next week. What is it you particularly want from me? Or what's the question you really want to have answered? So, some people have kind of one-to-one conversations afterwards, bilaterals, to say, how's it going? Is there anything else we could do with our meetings? And asking people to write discussions, a quick kind of record of the meeting, so we've got a copy, and that can be a good way of keeping on, understanding how the action's progressing. And some thoughts about effort in the upfront planning and prep, making sure the meeting is needed. Yeah, so great to see that there are lots of things that you're already doing to increase the effectiveness of your meetings, and that's what it's all about. We're all on a kind of learning curve. It keeps on changing. The trick is to have the practice of checking in, of reviewing, and of thinking, how can I keep making this just that little bit better? What's the kind of 1% I can go for next week, and the 1% after that, and everything will gradually be moving forwards. Okay, so we're pretty much towards the end of our time, and so I want to make sure that you're going to go away from this webinar with some action points for yourselves. One of the things I didn't ask was what proportion of your working week is spent in meetings, but as I say, I would hazard a guess that it's pretty high for quite a lot of you. So I'd like you to think about, of those 7 areas, of the 7 A's, Is there one that is jumping out for you right now that you think, oh yeah, I know that's the one I could really make some headway with? And what is one change that you can make for a meeting this week? Here we are, Monday afternoon. You've still got 4 working days. I know not everybody works all of them, but you've got plenty of time. So have a think. And if you want to share in the chat box, do. Top tip, getting people to share is a way of increasing their commitment. It's a commitment device. So if you want to write something down in the chat box to say, okay, this week I'm going to try questions on the agenda. This week I'm going to make sure all my meeting papers are sent out at least a day in advance. 2 days would be fantastic. 3 days, even better. This week I'm going to run around and see how that goes, getting people's conversation going. So what is it that you're going to do to make one really effective change this week? And in the meantime, I noticed a question from Sue: what to do about a key person who's not able to be online? Yeah, that's a potentially tricky situation. I guess I would wonder whether they could join by phone as a kind of a telephone conversation. That's not ideal, but on speakerphone with a laptop in your office, that might work. Otherwise, it's going to have to be a phone call or a different kind of one-on-one setup, and trying to make sure that they feel as included as they can. Or what could you do on email or other kind of text-based options? Obviously, it depends on what kind of access they've got, whether it's permanent or not. But yeah, I mean, it's approaching that issue with a sense of, how can I engage X person fully in the conversation given this situation, rather than oh gosh, I've got to figure out something awkward. How can I is a really good phrasing. So lovely to see all sorts of things coming up in here. Questions, attendees, considering if I'm needed, reviewing the approach. Brilliant. That's giving me some assurance that you've engaged and you found this useful and you've got some practical tips out of it. So that is it. If there's anything else that's coming up in terms of questions, now is the time to pop it into the chat box, and I'll keep my eye on that for a moment or two. And thank you again for your engagement. It's been lovely to see a really lively chat box, and you can catch up this webinar again with the recording, and that can be quite a good time to go through the chat box. One of the things I'm very conscious of is that even as a participant, let alone running this, it's very hard to have my attention on the visual of what I'm looking at, any slides, what I'm hearing, and the chat box, etc., etc. So in a way, it's quite nice to go back and have a bit of a read through and to see what else is there. And as I'm saying this, I'm not sure if the chat box does come up, but I think it does. So great. Thank you very much. Best of luck for all those meetings. You've got plenty of them. You've got important stuff to do. And I hope that each of your meetings will be that much better this week as a result. And take care and stay safe. Keep washing those hands, do the social distancing, all the stuff that we know we need to do. Thank you very much.
And thank you from me also. It was great to see so many people tuning in. I think Amy's just posted in the chat box about signing up to future webinars. The next one is on Wednesday of this week. I can't remember off the top of my head what it's about, but please do take a look at the website and tune in. See you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.